So the first clade of seed plants that we're going to talk about is the gymnosperm. So gymno means naked, and these are going to be naked seeds, meaning they're not going to be inside of like a fruit, which is what the angiosperms will be. So they're actually exposed on the sporophylls that form cones. And most gymnosperms form cone-bearing plants called conifers. So the most of the gymnosperms that you're going to be familiar with are conifers. Other groups of gymnosperms also have cones where they have the female sporophyll where the seeds are formed. So here we can see this branching here is where we've developed seeds, and we're going to see a diversion. Gymnosperms here are sister to the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. These arise fairly early in the fossil record. We believe these are probably the first seed plants to start to develop. These did really well when the earth started to become drier during the Carboniferous period. So at this point, they've got seeds that are going to have that protective coat around it to help preserve the baby seed, the baby plant, the embryo, which is going to be just better than pollen. A pollen grain is going to have a protective coat around it to help protect the male gametes. So that's going to be better than the non-seed plants that weren't able to protect themselves from the drying environment. There's evidence that gymnosperms were food for herbaceous dinosaurs, and fossils that show that gymnosperms were pollinated by insects. So these were dominant around 100 million years ago, and then at that time angiosperms started to become more dominant, and you see angiosperms are more dominant nowadays. So this is the life cycle of a typical gymnosperm. This would be like a pine tree. So we're going to start here with our sporophyte tree. So this is our diploid tree, and on this tree we have two types of cones. The one that you're more familiar with as a pine cone, that's the female ovulate cone. And then the pollen cones are the male cone. So the male cone is going to be full of microsporangia, which are going to create microspores that eventually become pollen grains. So the microsporocytes form pollen. So this is where the males undergo meiosis. Now I've got my male gametophyte, which is my pollen grain. While this is happening, the female cone has little ovules. So each of these little leaflets has a single ovule, which is the megasporangium, which has a megaspore inside of it. Pollination is actually going to happen here before the female megasporocyte has actually undergone meiosis. So right now, this female megasporocyte is still a diploid. The female megaspore is going to undergo meiosis, and so now we're going to start to see these haploid megaspores, and those are going to eventually develop into eggs. By the time the megaspore develops into an egg, the pollen will have reached the egg. So it takes a really long time for the pollen to go from the outside here at pollination all the way in to where the egg is going to be. And often this is going to take about a year between pollination, which is happening here, and fertilization, which happens here. So sometimes this can be as long as a year in this process. And then we will get a diploid new embryo. This develops into a full-on seed. So here's my embryo. My food supply will be in here, and then this is my protective covering. When that lands in the earth in a good environment, it germinates, turns into a seedling, which can then grow into a mature tree with both male and female cones. There are several groups of gymnosperms. The first one here is Cicadophyta. There's about 300 species of cycads. Most of them look like these large palm leaves. These are not true palm trees. True palm trees, the ones with coconuts, those are flowering plants. Coconuts are fruits. That's an angiosperm. These are kind of the short, stumpy palm trees that don't actually develop fruits. And there are some in Florida. There's even some on North Campus. Most of these are threatened, so 75% of them have been threatened by habitat destruction or other human actions. So the few species that are left are typically endangered. Another clade of gymnosperms is the Ginkgophyta, and there's only one species of Ginkgophyta, which is Ginkgo bilboa, and these are kept alive through human action. These do really well in urban environments because they tolerate air pollution, and they grow really well in like cities. So you can see that these are literally planted in a cement walkway. We typically only plant the male tree, and they turn really pretty yellow in the fall. These are the female ovulate cones, and when they occur, when they drop to the ground, they stink really badly. So in urbanization efforts, when people are trying to make an urban area really pretty with this tree, they'll often try to plant only a male tree rather than female, because the female ovulate cones are very smelly. Here's another phylum, which is Netophyta. It's a silent G. And these look crazy different from each other. So we have plants like Welwitschia, which grows in the desert. Ephedra grows in the desert. This is going to produce ephedrine. And then we have other ones like Netum, which are found in tropical forests in Africa and Asia. And they have these kind of flowering pods that almost look like a fruit, but these are actually cones. So these are really different plants. They look very different in very different environments. This phylum Netophyta is mostly developed through molecular data. So DNA sequencing is what tells us that these plants are going to be related closely to each other. And then the last phylum of gymnosperms that you're probably most familiar with is Coniferophyta, or the conifers. And these are the most common gymnosperm in the world today. Most of these have woody cones. Some of them have fleshy. So the juniper has a fleshy berry, but that's actually its ovulate cone. So these are going to be things like big Douglas fir trees, European larks, your pine trees. This bristlecone pine is one of the oldest conifers species that we know of, and we believe that it is about some of the trees of these bristlecone pines are about 4,600 years old. We've got the really large sequoia and redwood. Here's a man for size comparison for this tree. So some of the largest trees are also conifers. Most of these are evergreens and can carry out photosynthesis all year. They have really thin pine-like needles. And these kind of needles are going to help these trees retain water. So this is one of the advantages during that Carboniferous period when the planet was becoming drier. Having these skinny pine needles as opposed to big flat leaves helps those plants retain water and survive better.